I inherited a house on the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains from a grandfather who, for all intents and purposes, was a ghost in our family tree, only to find the local HOA president living in it like he was the king of the mountain. When he stood on my porch and told me I was trespassing on my own land, I didn't into oppose. He called the cops instead. I grabbed a winch, a heavy-duty chain, and a fallen oak tree to seal the only road out of there, trapping both of us in a 3-day psychological war that dug up secrets I wasn't into oppose. He prepared to handle. It's funny how a person can spend 30 years avoiding their past, only to have it hit them in the face the moment they try to claim what's theirs. And honestly, standing there in the cold October wind, I realized that some inheritances come with more than just property taxes and a drafty roof. The lawyer's voice on the phone had been as dry as old parchment when he told me about the estate, mentioning a name I hadn't into oppose. T heard spoken aloud since I was 6 years old, Silas Vance, my mother's father. He was a man who'd vanished into the Appalachian mist decades ago, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a family that decided it was easier to forget him than to wonder why he left. But curiosity, ISN, and oppose. T just a cat killer. It's a compass that points you toward trouble, and before I even had the keys in my hand, the letters started showing up at my apartment in the city. Big, aggressive envelopes with official seals, all signed by a man named Arthur Sterling, the president of the High Peak Estates Homeowners Association. The letters were a laundry list of grievances, overgrown weeds, a shed that was 3 inches too tall, peeling paint that, end quote, offended the natural aesthetic of the community, end quote. And the kicker was the bill, nearly $50,000 in accumulated fines for a house I didn't oppose to even know existed a month prior. I drove up that winding mountain road on a Tuesday, my truck groaning under the weight of my frustration, passing signs that warned of steep grades and narrow passes. The air grew thinner and colder with every mile, and the pine trees seemed to lean in close, whispering things I couldn't and oppose quite catch. But when I finally rounded that last hairpin turn and saw the house, my heart didn't and oppose just sink, it froze. There was smoke curling lazily from the chimney, a late-model SUV parked in the gravel driveway, and a set of brand-new rocking chairs on the porch that definitely didn't and oppose. Looked 30 years old. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, watching that smoke and feeling a slow, hot burn start in the pit of my stomach. This was supposed to be a ruin, a project, a piece of history I could sell or fix, but someone had turned it into a home, and judging by the, end quote, private property, end quote, sign on the gate, they didn't and oppose think it belonged to me. I climbed out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots like breaking bone, and walked up to the front door, half expecting a ghost to greet me. Instead, the door swung open before I could even knock, and there stood Arthur Sterling in the flesh, a man in his late 60s with silver hair combed back perfectly and a sweater that looked far too expensive for a mountain morning. He didn't end oppose. He looked surprised. He looked inconvenienced, like I was a salesman interrupting his lunch, and his first words weren't into oppose. A greeting, but a warning. End quote. You're about 20 miles past the point where you should have turned around, son, end quote, he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that practically dripped with unearned authority. I didn't oppose. Blink, I just held up the deed, the ink still fresh in my mind, and told him my name was Elias Vance, and that he was sitting in my living room. Arthur didn't oppose. Flinch. He just leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms with a smug little smirk that made me want to see red. He started quoting bylaws like they were scripture, telling me about Section 12, Paragraph B, which apparently gave the HOA the right to, end quote, manage and occupy, end quote, abandoned properties to prevent blight and maintain community standards. According to him, the house had been legally seized by the association years ago, and since he was the one who had put in the, end quote, sweat equity, end quote, to keep it from falling down, the board had granted him residency in lieu of a salary. It was the most sophisticated load of garbage I'd ever heard, a classic case of a small-town tyrant carving out a kingdom for himself because he thought nobody was looking. He told me I owed the HOA 50 grand, and that if I didn't and oppose leave within the hour, he'd have the local sheriff, who happened to be his cousin, up there to escort me off the mountain for trespassing. I could have argued, I could have shouted, but I saw the way he looked at me, with that condescending pity people give to those they think they've already beaten. He thought I was just some city kid who'd get scared by a big bill and a badge, but he didn't in Oppos. T realized that I'd spent the last decade working in demolition, and I knew exactly how to take things apart. I walked back to my truck without saying a word, ignoring his taunts about and quote, checking the fine print and quote, and I drove back down the road about a mile to where a massive oak had fallen during a storm the week before. It was a beast of a tree, half blocking the path already, and with my winch and a bit of calculated positioning, I dragged that 5-ton obstacle right across the narrowest point of the road. There were no shoulders, no bypasses, just a sheer drop on one side and a rock wall on the other, meaning that as of that moment, Arthur Sterling and I were the only two souls on that mountain, and neither of us was going anywhere until I got some answers. When I hiked back up the trail and appeared on the porch again, the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long, jagged shadows across the yard, and Arthur's smugness had evaporated into a frantic sort of confusion. He was pacing the porch, his phone held high in the air as he searched for a signal that didn't end Oppos. T exist, and when he saw me, his face went from pale to a deep, mottled purple. And quote, "What did you do?" End quote. He hissed, his voice cracking just enough to show the first hairline fractures in his composure. I just sat down in one of his fancy rocking chairs, kicked my boots up on the railing, and told him that the road was closed for maintenance. I told her we had plenty of food in my truck and plenty of wood for the fire, and that we weren't into Oppos. T leaving until he told me the real story of why he was so desperate to keep a dead man's house. That first night was a silent, freezing standoff, with Arthur barricaded in the master bedroom and me sprawled out on a dusty sofa I'd uncovered in the den, listening to the house groan under the weight of the wind. Every floorboard that creaked felt like a footstep, and every whistle of the wind through the eaves sounded like a voice, and I found myself wondering if my grandfather had sat in this same spot, feeling this same crushing isolation. By the second morning, the cold had started to do its work, and Arthur emerged from the bedroom looking 10 years older, his hair messy and his expensive sweater rumpled. He was hungry, and more importantly, he was terrified of the silence, because in the mountains, the silence doesn't end Oppos. T just sit there, it presses against you until you start talking just to prove you still exist. We sat at the kitchen table, a chipped Formica thing that looked like it belonged in a different era, and I pushed a thermos of coffee toward him, watching as he took it with shaking hands. I asked him how long he'd really been here, and the story started to spill out, not in a flood, but in a slow, agonizing drip of truth. He'd come to the mountain 12 years ago after his own life had shattered, a failed business, a divorce that took everything but his car, and a sense of shame that he couldn't end Oppos, T outrun. He'd found a Vance property, a place that the HOA had been ignoring for years, and he'd seen an opportunity to be someone again, to be the man in charge of a gated community, even if that community only had 5 other houses and most of them were empty half the year. He'd forged the board minutes, he'd invented the fines to keep my family away, and he'd spent a decade convinced that if he just took care of the place, it would eventually become his by some divine right of possession. But the real gut punch came when I heard a heavy thud from the ceiling, a sound that didn't end Oppos. T fit the rhythm of the wind, and before Arthur could stop me, I was up the stairs and pulling the cord to the attic. He tried to grab my arm, pleading with me to, end quote, just leave it alone, end quote, but I pushed past him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The attic wasn't in Oppos. T empty, it wasn't in Oppos. T full of insulation or old pipes. It was a museum. There were stacks of boxes, meticulously organized, containing everything Arthur had stripped from the downstairs rooms to make the house look, end quote, modern, end quote, and, end quote, acceptable, end quote. I opened the first box and felt the air leave my lungs because there, sitting on top, was a stack of letters, hundreds of them, all bundled with twine and addressed to my mother, my grandmother, and even to me. I tore one open, my hands trembling so hard I almost ripped the paper, and I read the words of a man who had an Oppos. T vanished because he wanted to, but because he was broken. My grandfather had been writing to us for 30 years, telling us about the garden he'd planted, the way the light hit the valley in the spring, and how much he regretted the silence that had grown between him and his daughter. Every single letter was marked in quote, return to sender in quote, but the addresses were correct, and that's when I realized the horrifying truth. Arthur hadn't oppos. He'd just been living in the house. He'd been intercepting the mail for years before my grandfather died, and even after. He'd been the one at the post office, the one with the P.O. box key, the one who ensured that Silas Vance died, thinking his family hated him. Also, Arthur could keep his little mountain sanctuary undisturbed. I looked at Arthur, who was huddled at the top of the attic stairs, the dusty light catching the tears on his face. And for a second, I didn't oppose. TC a villain, I just saw a pathetic, hollow shell of man who had stolen a family's peace to fill the hole in his own soul. He started babbling about how he'd load the old man, how he'd sat with him in his final days at the clinic down in the valley, and how he'd paid for the headstone with his own money because there was nobody else. He tried to justify it by saying he'd kept the house alive, that without him, the roof would have collapsed and the memories would have rotted, but all I could think about was my mother crying on Christmas morning because she thought her father didn't oppose. Care enough to call. We spent the rest of that day and the following night in that attic, going through the journal Silas had left behind, a 20-year chronicle of man trying to find his way back to the people he loved while a vulture sat on his porch and told him the world had moved on. By the third morning, the anger that had been driving me felt different. It wasn't oppose. Fire anymore. It was a cold, hard clarity. We hiked down to the road together, two men who had nothing left to say to each other, and we worked in total silence for 4 hours to clear the oak tree. Arthur moved like a ghost, his spirit completely broken, and when the road was finally open, he didn't oppose. Run for his car. He just stood there, looking up at the house one last time. I didn't oppose. Called the police, and I didn't oppose. Sue him into the ground, mostly because I realized that jail was too easy a sentence for a man who had to live with what he'd done. Instead, I made him a deal that was its own kind of prison. I took legal control of everything, dissolved the HOA's claim, and I made it clear that if he ever set foot on the property again, I'd release every single letter and journal to the entire county. He left that afternoon with nothing but a suitcase and the SUV he'd bought with HOA funds, leaving me alone in a house full of ghosts and letters that should have been read 20 years ago. Now, I spend my weekends up there, sitting on that same porch, reading my grandfather's words and trying to bridge a gap that's 3 decades wide. The house is quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet now, one that feels like a long-held breath finally being released. And sometimes I wonder if Arthur is out there somewhere, sitting in a generic apartment, finally feeling the weight of the silence he spent so long trying to cure it. It makes me think about the people we live next to, the in quote, pillars of the community in quote, who run the boards and sign the fines, and I wonder how many of them are just hiding in someone else in oppos. Life because they're too afraid to face their own. Do you think mercy was the right call here? Or did I let a man get away with the ultimate theft? I'd love to hear if any of you have dealt with a in quote, community leader in quote, who thought the rules didn't oppose. Apply to them, because from where I'm sitting, the most dangerous people aren't in oppos. The ones breaking the law, but the ones making it. Would you have let him walk away? Or would you have made sure he felt every bit of the isolation he forced on my grandfather? Let me know in the comments, because I'm still trying to decide if I did the right thing, or if I just let the mountain keep one last secret.